Amen. As Michelle mentioned there, we're launching a new sermon series for the month of November called Headlines and God's Lines. We're going to be talking about what's happening in our world, in our country, and not just here in the U.S., but around the world, because so much of what is happening in the world, the Bible talks about it. The Bible addresses it. The Bible gives us wisdom, advice, counsel as to how to move through these things, and many times tells us even how to understand these things. One of the biggest things that's in the headlines right now is the nation of Israel. Israel is dominating the headlines, and for good reason, because there's a lot happening in that part of the world right now. It all started 4 weeks ago on a Saturday morning, a Jewish holiday of Sukkot, which was the Feast of Tabernacles for them. For those of you who've studied Old Testament tabernacle feast, the Feast of Tabernacles was taking place, and 1,500 Hamas terrorists broke through the security perimeter separating the Gaza Strip from the nation of Israel, broke through that security perimeter with motorcycles and jeeps and paragliders and boats, and they went into Israel and killed over 1,400 people. 1,400 plus people were killed on that first day of fighting. It was a horrific act of terror against that nation, and I've heard some people say it was for Israel like 9/11 was for us. And so I was curious about that comparison. I was wondering how would that relate to us? And here's what I've come up with. If you take proportionality for their nation, which has fewer than 10 million people, 1,400 people were killed on that day, it would be the equivalent if someone came into our country and killed 50,000 people. That would be an incredibly horrific day. You remember how you felt on 9/11 when 4,000 plus people were killed that day? This would be as if 50,000 people had been killed. And so this is what happened to the nation of Israel just 4 weeks ago. This Palestinian Hamas terrorist broke through and started killing people. Israel has gone to war against them, and all this is dominating the headlines. And then the question is, okay, why? Why did this terrorist organization do this? And they have claimed that they are the ones who did it. They've taken credit for it. They claim that their goal is to kill anyone who is Jewish. It's in the Hamas charter, which was started in 1987. It was put in there in 1988. And so it's not that people are just saying they're doing this. It's in their own charter. They want to do this. And then the big question is, okay, why? Why would they want to do something that is so horrific? Why would they want to be guilty of such an act of terrorism? And there's a lot of answers that are out there. A lot of people are giving their answers. They'll call the Israelis colonists. They'll call them occupiers and different things like that. But there is an answer that goes far, far further than any of them are considering. And that's all the way back 4,000 years ago to some things that happened in this very part of the world 4,000 years ago. Take a look at our Bible, Genesis chapter 12. Now, at the end of Genesis chapter 11, there's a guy named Terah who leaves Ur the Chaldees. But in Genesis chapter 12, verse 1, it says, "The Lord said to Abram, leave your native country, leave your relatives, leave your father's family, and go to a land that I will show you." And I want to pause right there and just say this. Abraham was born in Ur the Chaldees, which would be southern Iraq. But now he's living in what would now be modern-day Turkey. And so he says, go to a land that I will show you. I will make you into a great nation. I will bless you. I will make you famous. And you will be a blessing to other people. I will bless those who bless you. And then I'm going to curse those who curse you. And all the families on the earth will be blessed through you. So Abraham departed as the Lord had instructed him. Lot went with him. Abram was 75 years old when he left Haran. Haran would be where modern-day Turkey is now. He took his wife Sarai, and he took Lot, and took all of his wealth, took his livestock and the people that were a part of his household at Haran, and they headed for the land of Canaan. And this is where the promised land is. And then when they arrived in Canaan, Abraham traveled through the land as far as Shechem. He set up camp beside an oak at Morah, and at that time the area was inhabited by Canaanites. But God appeared to Abraham and said, I will give you this land. This is where the nation of Israel is now. I will give you this land to your descendants. And Abraham built an altar there and dedicated it to the Lord who appeared unto him. And so at this point, God is telling Abraham, all of this land is going to belong to you. He's taken him out of Iraq, taken him out of Turkey, and taken him to this area. And this is the beginning of the Jewish nation. When Abraham and Sarah leave Turkey, they're not Jews. Everybody's Gentiles at this point. There are no Jews. This is where the Jewish people begin at this point. So what happens here is God says, I'm going to give you land. I'm going to bless you. I'm going to give you descendants. It's going to be an incredible thing I'm going to do for you. And God begins something that we see is still happening right here today. And so this is the first time God appears to Abraham, but jump forward a few chapters to Genesis 15, and God appears to Abraham again. He says, sometime later, the Lord spoke to Abraham in a vision and said, do not be afraid, Abram, because I'm going to protect you, and your reward is going to be great. But Abraham replied, okay, God, what good are all the blessings that you're giving me if I don't have a son? You haven't given me a son, and since you haven't given me any children, my servant Eleazar, he's going to inherit all this wealth. Verse 3, you've given me no descendants of my own. So no one, where's the nation going to be? Somebody else is going to get all of this. Verse 4, the Lord says to him, no, your servant will not inherit your property, will not inherit your land. This is going to be your family. You will have a son of your own. And so God promises he's going to have a child. Now, remember, he didn't even leave Haran until he was 75 years old. And so God's appeared to him again, verse 5. And the Lord took Abraham outside and said, look up into the sky and count the stars if you can. That's how many children you're going to have. Verse 6, and Abraham believed the Lord, and the Lord accounted to him righteousness because of his faith. Verse 7, and then the Lord told him, I'm the one who brought you out of Ur of the Chaldees, that's southern Iraq, to give you this land. I want you to have this land as your possession. And so the Lord made a covenant with Abram that day. I have given this land to your descendants. And here's what I want you to see. He gives him the borders, all the way from the border of Egypt to the great Euphrates River. And so I asked our team to put a map up on the screen, and you're going to see a map come up on the screen here. I think, do we have a map? There we go. We have a map. What you see in the yellow is where Israel is right now. What you see in the green is what God promised Israel they would have. So Israel is only occupying a very small part of what God said he would give to Abraham and his descendants. They don't even have everything. In fact, at no point in their history, under the reign of King David and the reign of King Solomon, they controlled about half of what you see is in green there. But today they only control this small part of what God has promised them. And so this is what God says, hey, I'm going to give all this to you, but they don't have it. They're not enjoying all of it. They're just enjoying this very small part. And so what is going on? What has happened that this is what took place? So jump to the next chapter. This is where the trouble happens. That we were just in Genesis 15. Now we're going to Genesis 16. Now Sarah, Abram's wife, had not been able to bear children for him, but she had an Egyptian servant named Hagar. And so Sarai said to Abram, now, gentlemen, when your wife wants to say something to you, listen to her. But before you do it, ask yourself, is it really a good idea? Because the Lord, she says to Abraham, the Lord has prevented me from having children. Go and sleep with my servant. Perhaps I can have children through her. And Abram agreed with Sarah's proposal. And so Sarah, Abram's wife, took Hagar, the Egyptian servant, and gave her to Abram as a wife. This happened 10 years after Abram had settled in the land of Canaan. So now they've been living in this new promised land for a decade. So Abram had sexual relations with Hagar, and she became pregnant. But when Hagar knew she was pregnant, she began to treat her mistress Sarai with contempt. Now just hang on that word contempt there for one moment. In the Hebrew, that word contempt is Hamas. In Arabic, it is an acronym for a Islamic resistance organization that has been formed, and in Arabic it means zeal or aggressive or passionate. But in Hebrew, it means evil or wicked. And so it's the same word with different meanings depending on which language you're reading it from. And it's just interesting the way that God does unique things like that. And so you have that word contempt there. In the original Hebrew, it would have been Hamas. And so verse 5, then Sarah said to Abraham, this is all your fault. I put my servant in your arms, but now that she's pregnant, she treats me with this Hamas, this evil. The Lord will show who's wrong, you or me. So this is where Ishmael is born. There's two sons that Abraham will have, Isaac and Ishmael. Ishmael is born first to him, born to Hagar, this servant who should have never been in existence. Now here's what I want you to see. God had given Abraham a plan. But in doubting, Abraham and Hagar produced something that God did not want to be produced. When you and I veer away from God's plan, we give birth to something in our lives that God never intended to be there. And if they had stuck, if Abraham and Sarah had stuck with what God told them, this would have never happened to them. And so here's what you see, this child is born. And then jump to chapter 17. When Abram was 99 years old, the Lord appeared to him and said, I am El Shaddai, God Almighty. Serve me faithfully and live a blameless life. I will make a covenant with you by which I will guarantee to give you countless descendants. And at this, Abraham fell to the ground. And then God said to him, this is my covenant with you. I will make you the father of a multitude of nations. What's more, as I'm changing your name, no more will you be Abram. Now you're going to be Abraham, for you'll be the father of many nations. And I will make you extremely fruitful. Your descendants will become many nations, and kings will be among them. I will confirm my covenant with you, your descendants after you, from generation to generation. This is the everlasting covenant. I will always be your God and the God of your descendants after you. And I will give this entire land of Canaan, where you now live as a foreigner, to you and your descendants. It will be their possession forever, and I will be their God. And then if you jump down a few verses, God begins to make a promise for Sarah. God says to Sarah, verse 15, regarding Sarah, your wife, her name will no longer be Sarai, but it will be Sarah, and I will bless her and give you a son from her. Sarah's going to have a son. Yes, I will bless her richly. She will become the mother of many nations. Kings and nations will be among her descendants. And then Abraham bowed himself to the ground, but he laughed at himself in disbelief and said, how could I become a father at the age of 100, he thought, and how can Sarah have a baby when she is 90 years old? God likes to wait until you are in a place of impossibility where the only thing you can do is trust in Him, and the only way you can survive is if He comes through supernaturally. And that's where God brought Abraham and Sarah, to a place where there was no hope for them outside of the supernatural intervention of God. And you look at that map and you see how small Israel is in proportion to the entire world. Here's what I want you to know about Israel. Israel is 1/5 the size of the state of North Carolina. North Carolina is 5 times the size of Israel. North Carolina has more in its population than all of Israel. We literally have 1 million more people living in North Carolina than the entire country of Israel. Israel is an incredibly insignificant speck on the map. There are 100 countries that have a larger population than Israel. Israel should not be dominating the news. There are bigger countries with bigger problems that we don't know anything about. Why do they dominate the news? Why is this happening? And it's all happening because something happened 4,000 years ago. A spiritual war began. It's a family feud, for sure, between Ishmael and Isaac. But it's also a spiritual war. And so verse 18, so Abram said to God, can Ishmael, the illegitimate son, can he live under your special blessing? Abraham loves his son. Make no mistake about this. Ishmael was still his son. He loves his son. And God says no. And that's where the war begins. Because God said no to Ishmael, but yes to Isaac. Sarah, your wife, will give birth to a son. You will name him Isaac, and I will confirm my covenant with him and his descendants as an everlasting covenant. And so this thing happens in the next verse. God says in verse 20, but I will bless Ishmael. And I read that. Now think of it for a moment. Ishmael is the father of the Arabic nations. There's over 22 different Arabic nations. I will bless Ishmael. And just as you have asked, I will make him extremely fruitful. And I will multiply his descendants. And he will become the father of 12 princes. And I will make him a great nation. And God has kept that for Ishmael. He really has. 22 different Arabic nations exist today. Far surpassing the amount of land that Israel has. Far surpassing the population that Israel has. So God has kept his covenant with Ishmael. Here's my question. But why? If Isaac is the son of Abraham and Sarah, and that's the one that you promised them, and Ishmael is just an illegitimate son that should have never been, why does God still bless Ishmael? And here's something you see in the character of God that we should always see about ourselves. And that's this. Even though Ishmael was not the one that God had promised Abraham, God still allowed him to be born. And every single person who was born is a child of God. And it doesn't matter how evil or wicked they can become. I have 3 kids. And I pray to God they're always wonderful, amazing, incredible, and loving. But if one of my 3 children turned out to be just an incredibly horrible person, I would still love them. And I would still do everything in my power to bless them and to help them. And I would never quit praying for them. And that is the nature and the character of God. Even though Ishmael is not the one that was promised, God said he's still my child, and I'm still going to bless my kids. But Isaac is the one with the covenant. And he says in verse 21, the covenant will be confirmed with Isaac, who will be born to you and Sarah about this time next year. And so this begins all of these things that are happening. This war between Isaac and Ishmael. Isaac is Israel. Isaac is the Jewish nation. Ishmael is all the Arabic nations. Just out of curiosity and preparing for this message, Israel became a nation in May of 1948. Became a nation because in the late 1800s, this Zionist movement was started to try and figure out what to do for the Jews, because Jews were being persecuted everywhere. Jews were being persecuted in Spain. Jews were being persecuted in Russia, persecuted all over the place. And so this Zionist movement developed, and they were trying to figure out a place for Jews to come together. And even at one time, this Zionist movement wanted to go into upstate New York and create a place in upstate New York that was for Jews to come together and live. But it eventually developed into this dream that Israel would go back to the promised land and they would be there. And so because of the Zionist movement, there were Jews who began to move back there. But here's what I want you to know. From the time that God promised Abraham this land until today, there have always been Jews living in what we call Palestine and Israel. There's always been Jews living there. And what you'll hear in the news is that they're colonizers. Well, colonizers are like the British Empire had colonies. They had their nation, and then they would rule over these other places. That's colonization. But there's no other nation called Israel ruling over that land. Israel is there. And so they can't be colonizers. And then they refer to them as occupiers. But they've been there for 4,000 years. I think that qualifies them as being indigenous. They've been there for 4,000 years, all this time. So why hasn't there been a nation of Israel for all this time? Well, in 586 BC, Israel not honoring God like they should, God allows the Babylonians to come in and attack them and destroy them as a nation. And they carried a lot of Jews away, but there were still Jews living there. And then the Greeks attacked the Babylonian Empire, but there were still Jews living there. And then the Romans conquered, but but we know that Jesus was born there, and there were still Jews living there. And then the Roman Empire fell to the Byzantines, and then the Byzantines fell to the Islamic Empire, and the Islamic Empire fell to the Christian Crusaders, and then that fell to the Mamluks, and the Mamluks fell to the Ottoman Empire, which took us right up to before World War I, where in World War I, the British Empire defeated the Ottoman Empire. And so that takes us up to 1917. But all this time, there are Jews living there. All this time, there are Jews living in the Promised Land. They never left. They were all around the world, but they're always a group that lived there. And the Zionist movement, they start coming back. And then 1917, Israel, or the British Empire, issues the Balfour Declaration, which begins the process for Israel to become a nation, and to become a nation in May of 1948. So why is it called Palestine? Because 100 years after the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus Christ, an emperor by the name of Hadrian got mad at the Jews, and to insult them, changed the name away from it being Israel to being Palestina, because he knew that would make the Jews mad if they did that. And so for the next 1,500 years, that land would be called Palestine. And so anyone born there, even a Jew born there, was considered a Palestine. In fact, many of the early prime ministers of Israel were considered Palestinian. Anyone born, even if you were a Jew, if you were born in that area, you received a Palestinian birth certificate. At least 4 of the early prime ministers, I tried to look this up, I wasn't able to get further information, but at least 4 of the early prime ministers of Israel actually had Palestinian passports. Because before 1948, if you were issued a passport, it would have been a Palestinian passport. And so when they lived there, that's the passport they had. And so what you see happening is a people that have been there for 4,000 plus years, and yet there's a whole other group of people that are intent on destroying them. Hamas has this in their charter that they want to destroy Israel. This isn't something that people are making up. It's something they put in their charter, but people are trying to destroy them. And so what you have is this. When God said to Abraham, I'm going to give you a son, and you're going to have many children, Satan said, I'm going to try and kill your children. And when God said to Abraham, I'm going to give you a son, you're going to have many children, and I'm going to give him land, Satan said, I'm going to try and take your land. And when God said, I'm going to give you a covenant, Satan said, I'm going to try and destroy the covenant. And so for the last 4,000 years, there's been this war, the enemy trying to battle against God, what God said he would do, to kill his children, to take their land, and destroy the covenant. Revelation 12:1 says it like this. Then I witnessed in heaven an event of great significance. I saw a woman clothed with the sun, with the moon beneath her feet, and crown of 12 stars on her head. She was pregnant, and she cried out because of her labor pains and the agony of giving birth. Then I witnessed in heaven another significant event. I saw a large red dragon, which is later identified as Satan, with 7 heads and 10 horns, with 7 crowns on his head. His tail swept away a third of the stars in heaven, a third of the angels fell. He threw them to the earth. He stood in front of the woman as she was about to give birth. This is Joseph and Mary giving birth to Jesus. The devil is going to try and destroy, ready to devour her as soon as the baby is born. But she gives birth to a son who is to rule all nations with their iron rod. He's the King of Kings. And her child was snatched away from the dragon, was caught up to God to his throne, and the woman fled into the wilderness. It's Joseph and Mary running to Egypt for a period of time, place prepared to care for her for 1,260 days. And then there was a war in heaven, and Michael and his angels fought against the dragon and his angels, and the dragon lost the battle, and his angels were forced out of heaven. The great dragon, the ancient serpent, called the devil or Satan, the one deceiving the whole world, was thrown down to earth with his angels. This is a spiritual war. Yes, it is a war in the flesh, but never mistake that what is happening in our physical world, even in your life and my life, is also spiritual. You can't dissect the two and say, well, this is natural, physical, this is earthly, and this over here is spiritual, and this has a spiritual realm. They're always intertwined. As long as you are in this body, you are a spiritual man housed in a temporary physical body. This is an eternal spiritual war that is happening here in a temporary physical earth. It's a spiritual war. And anti-Semitism is Satanism. People who hate the Jews are inspired by demonic influences to hate the Jews. Anytime you are inspired to hate anything, that's the influence of Satan. And it doesn't matter what Satan does, because God told Abraham in Genesis 15:18, I'm making a covenant with you. I've given you this land to your descendants, all the way from the border of Egypt to the great Euphrates River. There will come a day when Jerusalem will fall, but that only sets up the return of God to come down and wipe them out. And so here I want you to see this. How does all this play out into the end times? Or does it play out in the end times? I want to show you one passage in Ezekiel 38. This is another message that came to me from the Lord. Son of man, turn and face Gog of the land of Magog. The land of Magog is where modern-day Russia is. The prince who rules over the nations of Meshech. Meshech is where the modern-day city of Moscow is. And Tubal. Tubal is a city that's in Siberia. And prophesy against him. Give him this message from the sovereign Lord. Gog, I am your enemy. I will turn you around and I will put hooks in your jaws to lead you out with your whole army, your horses and your charioteers in full armor, and a great horde of armed with shields and swords. Persia, Ethiopia, Libya will join you. Here's what I need you to see. Persia is where modern-day Iran is. In 2007, Russia invited Iran to join with them in an organization that counters NATO. And so even though they have not officially joined that, in 2007, the invitation was issued for them to join. And so Iran, which is Persia, and Magog, which is Russia, have already given each other the opportunity to partner with each other. With all their weapons, Gomer and all his armies will also join you, along with the armies of Beth Togarmah from the distant north and many others. Get ready, be prepared, keep all the armies around you mobilized, and take command of them. A long time from now, you will be called into action in the distant future. You will swoop down on the land of Israel, which will be in joy and peace after recovering from war, and after its people have returned from lands to the mountains of Israel. And so right there you see a prophecy of what is modern-day Russia, which would have been Magog in this prophecy, and Persia, which is modern-day Iran, saying they would partner together. There's other nations that are listed there. Some of that is already in the process. And so is this an indication that it would be, that we're right now in the end times? And the answer is maybe, maybe not. And here's why I say that. Because Jesus makes this statement. Matthew 24, verse 3. Later, when Jesus sat on the Mount of Olives, his disciples came to him privately and said, tell us when all this will happen. What will be the signal of your return and the end of the world? And Jesus said to them, don't let anybody mislead you. His first concern was that his people would be misled, that they would be deceived. And I still believe that that is the greatest concern of Christianity today, is that Christians would be deceived about what is and what isn't happening. Don't believe everything you read on the news, but do believe everything you read in your Bible. Absolutely. He said, don't be deceived, because there's a lot of people that will come in my name claiming I am the Messiah, and they will deceive a lot of people, and you will hear of wars, and you'll hear threats of wars. But don't panic. Yes, these things must take place, but the end will not follow immediately. Nation will go to war against nation, kingdom against kingdom. There will be famines and earthquakes in many parts of the world. But all of this is only the first of the birth pains, with more to come. And so Jesus says, yeah, all these things are going to be a sign of the end. But don't buy into any one individual's idea that they know exactly what God is going to do. This week I read in the news that there's a new nuclear weapon that has been developed by the U.S. and it's incredible, the size and the destruction. It can kill 300,000 people in one split second. That's an incredible thing. There's a lot of things in the news. But here's what I want us as a church, is when we read the headlines, I want us to also know what God says. And yes, there is a nation called Israel that's being attacked, but they are on their promised land because God gave it to them 4,000 years ago. And there will always be people who hate them. And the reason they hate them is because when God told Abraham, you're going to have a son, Satan said, I'm going to try and kill your son. And when God said, you're going to have land, Satan said, I'm going to try and steal your land. The thief comes not but to steal, to kill, and destroy. But God said, I've come that you might have life and that you might have it more abundantly. And so we believe in the King of Kings. We believe in the Lord of Lords. We believe in the Prince of Peace. We believe in the mighty God. And so whatever happens, the headlines do not determine the future. What determines what happens is what's written in God's Word. If you agree with that, stand to your feet and let's give the Lord a great big hand clap of praise. Let's do that real big. As I was studying, I'm just going to be honest with you. I probably won't tell this to the 10 o'clock and 11:30 services, but I'm going to just share this with you. When I was preparing, I thought to myself, you don't need to preach this. Everybody knows this. Like, this is all, like, you've known this since you were third grade. Third grade was a very good year for me. But as I was sitting there, I was like, there may be a few people who know all this information, but most people don't know it. And so I decided to preach it this morning, because what you need to know is that there is a spiritual war. And the spiritual war begins in Genesis chapter 3. 3 chapters from the beginning of the Bible, the war begins. It intensifies when God divides the Gentiles from the Jews. But here's the end of the book. 3 chapters into the Bible, the war begins. But 3 chapters from the end of the Bible, God ends the war forever. And that's where your confidence needs to be. That's where your trust needs to be. He's in charge of everything. And so if you have anxiety or worry or fear because of all what you're reading in the headlines, I promise you, what's in God's lines is so much better. And there might be some difficult days ahead for you and me. But at the end of everything, we will reign forever with the King of Kings. In the name of Jesus. Father, I pray for every single person here. I pray, God, that you would encourage them, that you would lift them up, that you would bless them. And I pray just as Abraham was counted righteous because of his faith in you, I pray that we would put our faith and confidence in you. And no matter what the headlines say, we'll believe your word in the name of Jesus Christ.